As a chief information security officer, we don't control the threats. I can't control foreign adversaries. I can't control whether somebody's going to target me with ransomware, but I can control the vulnerabilities. I can control the weaknesses. Welcome to Life of a CISO. I'm Dr. Eric Cole, your host, and we'll be taking you on a journey each week on what it takes to be a CISO and what are solutions that you can implement today if you are currently a Chief Information Security Officer or if you want to be one in the future. This is Life of a CISO. Welcome to this week's edition of Life of a CISO with yours truly, Dr. Eric Cole. With everything going on in the news and all the breaches and ransomware attacks and everything happening, I almost feel like we need to do an episode of Back to the Basics. Actually, I don't feel like we should. We are, right? So this week's episode of Life of a CISO is going to sort of be back to the basics with cybersecurity. What are the core fundamental principles of cybersecurity that we need to follow? Because I feel like these attacks that we're seeing today are not that advanced. Yes, they're coming from organized groups. They're coming from entities that have basically commercialized cyber criminal activity with ransom payments and extortion. But the means and methods and ways they're getting into systems are standard traditional methods. And not all, right? Not all, some, but not all attacks are not preventable. But these, I feel like they could have been prevented. They could have been controlled and they could have been managed, but we're just sort of violating some of the basic fundamental principles of cybersecurity. So as a chief information security officer, or if you're somebody that wants to be a chief information security officer, we need to sort of step back and say, okay, what are the key core areas of focus that we need to make sure that we're paying attention to and focusing on? To do that, let's just do a quick review. What is cybersecurity? We've done many episodes on this, and I'm still amazed when I run across folks that have been CISOs for 7, 8, 9 years, world-class security engineers for 15 years. And I always ask that basic question, what is cybersecurity? And it's sort of like a trick question. Like a couple of them are like, come on, Eric, you know what it is. I'm like, no, if somebody came up to you and said, what do you do for a living? And you said you work in cybersecurity. And they said, what is cybersecurity? What would you tell them? And it's funny, scary, and in a few cases, a little embarrassing, right? That people can't answer that question, right? That they're not able to give me a simple answer of what is cybersecurity. So it's real basic, straightforward 3 things. Cybersecurity is all about understanding, managing, and mitigating risk of your critical data being disclosed, altered, or denied access. Cybersecurity, at the end of the day, are 3 things. It's managing risk, it's understanding, protecting, and controlling critical data, and it's the C.I.A. triad: confidentiality, integrity, availability, right? And we all know confidentiality is prevent, detect, deter. The unauthorized disclosure of information. Integrity is prevent, detect, deter the unauthorized alteration of information. And availability is prevent, detect, deter the unauthorized denial of access to information. So those are really the 3 things we need to focus on. So let's start off with risk. Risk is the probability of loss. Risk essentially is focused on threats and vulnerabilities. Threats are the potential for harm, things that could negatively impact your organization, such as ransomware, and vulnerabilities are weaknesses that allow those threats to manifest themselves. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you look at the risk formula, risk, the probability of loss, equals threats, the potential for harm, times vulnerabilities, weaknesses, or exposures. Which of those do we typically control? As a chief information security officer, we don't control the threats. I can't control foreign adversaries. I can't control whether somebody's going to target me with ransomware, but I can control the vulnerabilities. I can control the weaknesses. But here's where that problem comes in. A lot of people short circuit the risk formula. They go in and say, okay, because I can only control vulnerabilities, I can't control threats, I'm just going to go in and fix vulnerabilities. And I've seen organizations that try different strategies, things like a vulnerability a day, fixing a vulnerability a day keeps evil away, or one where we fix 10 vulnerabilities a week. Another one said, oh, we're going to fix the low-hanging fruit so we have some good metrics for executives. Now, any of those initially gets a lot of good positive response. Why? Executives are looking for metrics. Executives want data-driven cybersecurity. So if you're going in and saying, well, we're fixing 10 vulnerabilities or 12 vulnerabilities or 15 vulnerabilities a day, that's a clear metric to show you're making progress and moving forward. It works until it doesn't work, which is when a breach happens because it's not effective. You don't want to fix the low-hanging vulnerabilities. That's a waste of time if there's not a threat with a high likelihood and a vulnerability with a big impact. We only want to fix real vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Now, I'll sometimes get pushback going, but wait, Eric, wait. Isn't it better to do something than nothing? And I would argue no. I would argue that you're wasting time, energy, and effort. If vulnerabilities were finite and static, so boom, these are your vulnerabilities. They don't change, and they're a set amount. Then I would absolutely agree doing anything is better, because if you're doing 10 vulnerabilities a week, eventually you're going to get to zero and eventually you fix everything. Now, maybe it's not the highest priority, but still, if it's finite and static, you'll eventually fix this problem. However, vulnerabilities are dynamic and infinite, which means every dollar an hour you're spending on fixing a vulnerability that there's no threat. It's benign. There's no issue. Whether you fix it or not is not going to have any impact on your business one way or another. So now you're wasting time, energy, and effort on things that don't matter, which isn't good. So you always want to make sure that we're looking at the threats that have the highest likelihood and the vulnerabilities that have the biggest impact against your critical data. Just want to take a quick break. I hope you're enjoying the show. I have this free webinar that I would love for you to check out if you want to become a world-class CISO. So one of the things I always recommend CISOs do, which I call it the CISO quick risk assessment. You can do this depending on how well you know your organization in a day or a week, depending on how much research you need. But it's real simple. One page. I actually use physical paper because when you use computers, you can put a lot more in that's needed. So one physical page, and I fold it into 3 columns. So imagine a piece of paper broken equally into 3 columns. The first column, I write at the top, critical assets, and in parentheses, I put business processes that support them. So the first thing you need to do is say, for our organization, what are the critical assets? What are the most critical business processes that we need to run our organization? Now, important here, you only get 1 column. It's only 1 piece of paper. I like 5. If you want to push it to 7, I'll let you, but we're not going to go more than that. You got to prioritize. You can't write everything. What are the 5 most critical business processes for your organization? What are the 5 most critical pieces of data for your business? You need to know that. You must know that in order to implement effective security. Then the second column builds on the first and says, based on these business processes, based on these critical assets that we have, what are the threats that would have the highest likelihood of occurrence against them? And once again, we want 5 to 7. It's 1 piece of paper, 1 column. Once you have that, then your third and final column are vulnerabilities. You now say, what vulnerabilities would allow these threats to impact our critical data? would have the highest impact to our critical data. And then you list those vulnerabilities. Now, when you're done with this exercise, you look at the right-hand column, vulnerabilities with the highest impact, and boom, you now have your roadmap. You now have the areas you focus on. Those are the things that if you don't fix are going to cause the biggest problem, the biggest issues, and the biggest breaches to happen to your organization. That becomes your focus area. So I urge you to do that. But what I've done is over my 30-year career, I always look for patterns. And I'm very big on everything leaves clues. So I've done this for hundreds upon hundreds of organizations, and I'm always looking for reoccurring themes. I'm looking for patterns of what are the common vulnerabilities. And I use that to create rules. And based on that, I've created 2 rules of security. First one is any systems accessible from the internet must be fully patched. If a system has either a visible IP or you're doing static mapping and you can get to it, if the systems are accessible in any way, shape, or form, even with password protected. So I had one client that goes, Eric, we don't have any systems accessible from the internet. And I said, you worked from home for 9 months during the pandemic. How did you get in? Oh, well, we SSH'd and VPN in. I said, to what? And they said, well, those 3 servers. I said, those are accessible from the internet. And they said, no, they're not. And I'm like, okay, are we really going to go here? Right? How in the world are you accessing them from your house if they're not accessible? And they're like, but Eric, they're password protected. Nobody can get in. I'm like, you're changing the question. I don't care whether somebody can log in. I don't care whether you're blocking ping. I don't care any of that. If there is a server where somebody from the internet can connect to it for whatever reason, whether it's open web server, whether it's SSH, whether it's VPN, that system is accessible from the internet. So I just want to make sure we're crystal clear. Don't go in and add caveats that are not helpful. If it's accessible from the internet, if anybody can get to it, even with passwords or secret handshakes, right, it is accessible. Any system accessible from the internet must be fully patched. Now, people always say, well, how quickly? I'm a big fan with attacks today is within 5 days. Now, if you want 10, that's okay. If you're going more than 30, that's pushing it. Remember, this is how attackers are getting in. Attackers are getting in because we have systems accessible from the internet missing patches, and that's how they're exploiting the system. So if you're taking 30 days, that's a 30-day window that somebody can break in. That's a 30-day window that somebody can exploit. So those systems, and when I work with my clients, any system accessible from the internet patched within 5 days. Oh, but Eric, we can't do that because patching systems break it and we got to go through this. I'm gonna call BS on you. Show me the data. If you have systems accessible from the internet, show me the data that patches break that system, that patches crash the system. Now, don't give me proprietary internal. Right? I had a client I'm working with. They're like, Eric, well, our internal proprietary systems that are separate and air-gapped, they're running such bizarre software that we really can't patch it. Great. I'm not talking about those. Those are internal. I'm only talking about right now, I want you to show me systems that are accessible from the internet, that people can get to from the internet. I want you to show me that patches are crashing those systems. Because I do the data and it's like 0.000, right? Today, patching is very stable, right? Patching is very, very robust. So I have not seen it as a problem. I have not seen it as an issue. So we need to make sure that we're not using old, false, or fabricated things to drive our decisions. Second, oh, but Eric, we have systems that can't be patched. The applications are old. The applications aren't updated. And they need to be accessible from the internet. If the system, if that's true, if you're running older applications and you can't patch, that system is not worthy. That system cannot be accessible from the internet. Oh, but Eric, we have to have people access it. Yes, set up a VPN, set up something else. right? But I don't have a lot of rules. I only have two. I only have two rules. But trust me, every time somebody breaks that first rule, where they have systems accessible from the internet that are missing patches, it never ends well. And my question to you is this. Okay, you're telling me that you can't patch the system and you're unwilling to put it behind a VPN. How much would it cost to do that? How much would it cost so that system is not directly accessible from the internet? Well, about $400K. Great. You can go in and spend $400K, or you don't spend the $400K and you have a 90% chance of getting hit with ransomware. And depending on the size of your organization, will definitely be more than 400. It could be 5 million. It could be 11 million. It could be 20 million. So which do you want? Do you want a 90% chance of having to pay a $5 million ransom, or do you want to pay $400K? Your choice. But that's how we have to present the information to executives. The two problems I'm seeing today is, one, security folks are making dangerous decisions. They're going in and saying, Eric, it's too complex. It's too hard to put a VPN in place, to put it behind the system. We're just going to take the risk. And the executives are completely and totally unaware. That's not your decision. Even as a CISO, that's not your decision. You need to present the data to the executives. So that's problem one. Problem two, the data is not being presented correctly. So the way a lot of companies are presenting, they go to the executives, they go, listen, we really don't want to do this, but do you want to spend $400K on all this complexity and all this stuff to add a little bit of security? I mean, if you present it that way, of course no one's going to say yes. And the problem is it's presented assuming what we're doing today is safe. So if you go to the execs and say, listen, we have these systems that are accessible from the internet, and we want to spend $400,000 to fix it. It's going to be a lot of work, a lot of complexities there. They're saying, okay, everything's fine on $400K. Of course, they're going to deny it. You're not giving the accurate data. The accurate data is you're in a huge risk position. The accurate data is the recent ransomware attacks did not come in directly through email like others. They actually came in through unpatched systems. That's how they came in. They changed their operation, their mode of operation. So this is a huge problem. So you now need to go to the execs and say, listen, the new ransomware is going after systems just like this that are out of date, running out of date software without recent patches. This is the current exposure point. So it could be 80 or 90, pick what you want, but it's a high risk, high probability that we're going to get hit with ransomware. And the average payment could be 2 to 5 million. Or we can spend $400K. What would you like? Right now, we're doing it correctly. Now we're giving the accurate information. But to me, when I do vCISO, CISO, consult with clients, like I said, everything's negotiable but two things. First one is any system that's missing patches is not accessible from the internet. Non-negotiable. Too many problems, too many issues. It's just not worth the risk. It's just not worth it. Second, any system that's accessible from the internet never contains critical data. Never, ever contains critical data. And this can be critical business processes. So it can be something that's running oil and gas, hint, 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 right? The pipeline, right? So when I'm saying it's really business processes. So two simple rules, non-negotiables. Any system accessible from the internet must always be patched and up to date. And any system accessible from the internet must never contain critical data, critical processes, or critical systems. Those are non-negotiables. So those we have to have in place there. And like I said, you can't change the rules on me. Don't say, oh, I had a client going, Eric, these systems technically are accessible, but because we have two-factor, it's an acceptable risk. Once again, not your decision, right? You need to make the executives aware of these exposure points. You need to make sure that they recognize that this is how attackers are getting in to our systems. So two core fundamental rules. Any system accessible from the internet is fully patched and never contain critical data. And I'll tell you right now, if those rules were followed, we wouldn't have had what we've had over the last 6 months. We wouldn't have had what we had over the last 18 months. right? Those things would not have happened and would not have occurred if we followed those fundamental rules. Now, let's take the critical infrastructure, because we're seeing pipeline, we're seeing manufacturing, we're seeing various critical infrastructure now getting targeted and exposed. So let me explain a little bit why. You can go back, it's approximately 10 or 12 years ago when critical infrastructure started switching from manual valves to computer-based. Now, some is longer, some is shorter, but that's a general average. So they started switching over to computers to run manufacturing, oil and gas, water, critical infrastructure, electricity. Now, as you can imagine, computers that are running this critical infrastructure, it's all about availability. It's all about stability. You want them up and running and very, very stable, which means you're not going to be running the latest version of an operating system. Latest versions of operating systems have less stability than older versions, right? Because there's less updates, there's less patches, there's less control over it. Second, anytime you apply a patch, you change the code and you can change the stability of it. So the rule was, we're going to get an older operating system that's very stable with a certain patch level. And once we verify and validate, you got to go through extreme approval processes. That's locked and loaded. You don't change it, you don't alter it, you don't modify it. So we know that these systems are slightly out of date, and we know these systems are not patched and not updated. And that's by design. That's a conscious decision we made for stability purposes. Now, as you can imagine, we had to come up with a mitigating control because unpatched systems are big exposure. So we needed a mitigating control, and the mitigating control was air gap. These systems, whether in nuclear, we call them critical digital assets, CDAs, and you have other names in other industries, but these critical systems that run the critical infrastructure are air gapped and isolated. They are not connected to any other network, and they're not connected to the internet. Air gap, right? Air gap, separation point. That means physical separation. There's no possible way to breach these systems unless you physically breach the facility. That's why when you see critical infrastructure and nuclear reactors, they have guards with guns. They have multiple fences. When you're getting into the nuclear reactor, you have to go through almost 3 levels of physical security with guards, guns, and others. So yeah, good luck with that, right? In a lot of cases, it's sometimes easier to get into a government facility than it is to get into a nuclear reactor these days. So good luck with that. But air gapped, completely and totally air gapped from the rest of the network. And that worked. Then starting in 2018, for automation. Oh, we need to better automate billing and processing and other things, so we need direct access to that information. So they started connecting these systems to the business network. Now, once again, still indirect connectivity to the internet, but now the air gap is gone. Now there's no air gap because now from internet to business, you can get in. Then with the pandemic, in order for people to work from home in these environments, they now took these systems and gave them access to the internet. So now just play this out. You have a system with known vulnerabilities, missing patches, violating Rule 1, directly connected to your critical processing capabilities, violate Rule 2. And what did you think was going to happen? Exactly what we saw. Right? Colonial, pipeline, meat processing, all these things, and they will continue until we go back to the fundamental rule of air gaps. There's a reason we created those. Now, once again, can't change the rule. I saw an interview where somebody said, yes, we have our critical infrastructure connected to the internet, but we have a virtual air gap. No, you can't do that. Like, that's not an air gap. You can't change the definition of terms because it's convenient to you. An air gap is a physical separation. If your systems are connected to the internet, you don't have an air gap. You can't change the definition saying that systems connected to the internet with other security controls can now be an air gap. That's not the definition, and that's the problem. Stop making things convenient in the name of security. Stop confusing the public by changing the definition of terms that doesn't make any sense. An air gap is an air gap. Air gap, right? I know I get excited about this stuff, right? It's a separation point. So if we're just looking at all the attacks that are out there, it's because we broke our rules of air gap design, where you have your critical infrastructure, sometimes called your OT network, and your IT, operational technology, information technology. The information technology is the business network connected to the internet for email, and your OT is the critical infrastructure. You got to have air gap. We got to have that separation. We got to have that breakpoint. Then for all of our other systems, we need to make sure that any system that's accessible from the internet is fully patched, and they never contain critical data or access to critical business processes. Not that hard, right? If we follow these core rules, right, these problems start going away very, very quickly. So to me, let's not overthink it. Let's not make it overly complicated. Let's not add a lot of stuff. Let's go back to the root cause. The vulnerabilities that are present that are causing these breaches to happen today. Now, if we fix this, I can guarantee we'll see a new level of breach. The attackers are not going to go away, but let's focus on the current problem. Let's keep our air gaps in place. Let's patch, and systems accessible from the internet never contain critical data. And if you do that, and you come along with me, we can absolutely make cyberspace a safe place to live, work, and raise a family. Make sure you pick up a copy of my book, Cyber Crisis. If I can help you become a world-class CISO, sign up for my CISO certification. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Life of a CISO.